Beneath Egypt's Great Pyramid rests a chamber never meant to be found. Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. Beneath the sun-baked stones of Giza, where wind carries whispers from an age that no human alive can remember, there are stories that still stir the dust. Some say the Great Pyramid keeps no secrets left to tell. Others believe its deepest truth remains hidden in a place no living soul has yet walked in modern times, a sealed chamber, spoken of in half-forgotten papyrus fragments, and hinted at in the echoes of ground-penetrating scans. Tonight, we journey softly through time and shadow, following the threads of ancient ambition, sacred geometry, and the human hunger for what lies just beyond reach. We move slowly, gently, for this is not a tale of conquest, but of quiet wonder, the kind that belongs to moonlit sands and the silent watch of the Sphinx. And as we drift together through this story, know that we truly love and care for you. Your curiosity, your rest, and your dreams matter here. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Under the slow golden sweep of evening light, the desert begins to change. The heat of the day releases its grip on the air, and the sands that seemed so still under the blinding sun now begin their quiet migration. They move not in haste, but with the patience of centuries, each grain drifting where the wind chooses, reshaping ridges and hollows in a rhythm older than language. Somewhere in the distance, a caravan moves toward the river, its bells sounding in soft, uneven intervals, not loud enough to disturb the stillness, only enough to remind you that life still passes here, even at the edge of eternity. The Great Pyramid stands against this sky as it has for 4,500 years, its silhouette catching the last flare of the sinking sun. At this hour, the limestone blocks turn the colour of warm honey, their shadows stretching out like long ancient fingers across the plateau. Each block, once carved and set by human hands, now feels as though it belongs to the earth itself, inseparable from the desert floor. You cannot help but feel the weight of the builders in their work, not just their strength, but their devotion. The lines of the pyramid are too precise, the angles too exact, for them to have been anything less than deliberate in every choice they made. In the cooling air, the sound of the wind curls around the stones like a whisper just out of reach. It is easy to imagine that the builders are still here, not in body, but in the tension between silence and echo. The air smells faintly of sand and stone, with a dryness that carries history on its back. You can feel it on your skin, in your breath, as though the desert is reminding you that it was here before you arrived, and it will be here long after you have gone. The first stars appear in the east, pale and hesitant at first, before the deepening twilight coaxes them into sharper light. The vastness of the desert sky pulls your gaze upward, but the pyramid's quiet gravity always draws you back. Its presence is magnetic, holding you in place even as the horizon cools. In that stillness, you become aware of a strange sensation, as though the pyramid is watching you as much as you're watching it. There is no movement on its face, no sound but the wind and the distant bells, yet something lingers in the air. It is not a presence that wishes to be known outright, but rather one that waits for the right moment to reveal itself. Beneath those immense layers of stone, there is something sealed, untouched for millennia, lying in the kind of darkness that does not merely obscure, it preserves, a place where time has been paused perfectly for thousands of years. Tonight we do not rush toward it. We move slowly, tracing the outline of this vast monument as the shadows deepen, allowing ourselves to feel the shifting moods of the sand and stone. Every story begins somewhere, but this one begins here, at the edge of night, listening to what the wind does not say. It is in this quiet, in the moment between sunset and darkness, that we take our first step toward the forbidden chamber. The earliest seekers who came to the Great Pyramid did not arrive with scanners or cameras. They came with chisels, oil lamps, and the stubborn belief that every wall must lead somewhere. The limestone casing, once smooth as polished ivory, bore no inscriptions to guide them, no polite invitations to enter. So they made their own marks. Crude letters, scratched by foreign hands, still remain in sheltered places, their dates spanning centuries. The names of captains, merchants, and adventurers were carved there, a fragile defiance against the scale of what they had found. But while some passageways yielded to their persistence, there were others that resisted absolutely, doorways where the stone itself seemed to grow heavier under their touch. These were not accidents of collapse or the result of forgotten masonry. In the dim glow of their oil lamps, explorers saw the precision of the fit, joints so exact that not even a knife blade could slip between them. The blocks were not merely set in place, they were wedged with the weight of the pyramid above them, as though the builders had designed the entire structure to keep these thresholds forever closed. More than once, men would spend days attempting to breach such a seal, only to find that each strike of the chisel rang out with the dull, unyielding sound of futility. The old Arab chroniclers speak in passing of doors of balance within the pyramid, slabs so perfectly counterweighted by the surrounding stones that to remove them would require dismantling the walls themselves. These barriers, they wrote, were not locked in, the way of a gate, but anchored in the way of a mountain. To move one would be to disturb the pyramid's heart. In the dry chambers beyond the visible corridors, the air itself seemed reluctant to shift, as though it clung to the memory of those who had last stood there. The earliest written accounts from these explorers, brittle pages now kept in museum drawers, reveal an unspoken awe. They write less about what they found, and more about what they could not reach. There are descriptions of narrow shafts ending abruptly in blank stone, of archways half buried under massive slabs, of hollow-sounding walls that refused to reveal their secrets. But centuries before these adventurers ever arrived, the sealing of these passages was an act carried out not by soldiers or guards, but by the hands of priests. The builders may have known the design, but the priests knew the purpose. In temple records now scattered and incomplete, there are hints of a ritual closing, not in a hurry, not in secrecy, but in a deliberate ceremony. The corridors were walked one last time, lamps burning low, incense thick in the air. The sacred objects, whatever they were, had already been placed inside. The priests moved slowly, speaking words not meant for mortal ears, their voices low and measured in the cool stone halls. Then came the placing of the blocks, granite and limestone, hewn so precisely they seemed to hum when slid into place. Each was positioned with care, not to keep danger out, but to keep the chamber within untouched by the restless world. These were not barriers born of fear, but of devotion. To them, what lay beyond was not a prize for the worthy. It was a trust that must not be broken until time itself gave permission. Even now, in those sealed corridors where the air has not moved for thousands of years, that reverence endures. The silence feels different there, thicker, more complete, as though it knows what it is keeping. It is a silence that humbles, reminding all who listen that not every mystery is meant to be solved in our lifetime. And somewhere behind one of those unyielding seals, perhaps at a point where the geometry of the pyramid converges into perfect balance, lies the first whisper of the forbidden chamber. Waiting, patient, certain that it will not be disturbed before its appointed moment. Inside the pyramid, there are places where the walls speak in the way one might expect, with carved symbols flowing like a stone-bound script, their forms as fluid as the river that sustained the civilization. But in the Great Pyramid of Khufu, this language is strangely absent. In a world where every doorway, lintel, and burial wall was an opportunity to proclaim the power of gods and kings, here we find stretches of perfect, unbroken stone. No falcons in flight, no lotus blooms, no processions of the afterlife, only the hushed geometry of the blocks themselves. At first glance, such absence might seem accidental, a result of time or erosion, but those who have studied the interiors know better. The blocks are too well cut, the surfaces too untouched, for this to be the slow work of centuries. These walls were left deliberately blank. The stone is smooth and pure, almost as if the hand of the mason had been guided to stop before the chisel could make its first incision. The silence of these surfaces is not neglect, it is choice. Ancient Egypt was a civilization steeped in narrative. Every carving was an act of permanence, a way of speaking to eternity. The pharaoh's deeds, his divine ancestry, the cosmic order, all were etched into stone so that the future would never forget. To withhold inscription in such a sacred monument was to withhold a voice. And to withhold a voice meant there was something the living world was not permitted to hear. Priests may have walked these halls with their oil lamps, the golden light brushing against the blank surfaces. Perhaps their fingers traced the smoothness as a reminder that some knowledge must remain unspoken. To carve was to declare, to leave blank was to hide. And so, in the pyramid's most curious spaces, silence became a language all its own. Scholars have long debated the reason for this absence. Some suggest these rooms were never meant for the living, that the builders spared no effort on beauty because the space was purely functional, a hidden passage, a structural void. Others believe the opposite, that the rooms held such importance that their meaning could not be entrusted to visible marks. In the absence of images, the space itself became the message, a sacred container in which the truth lay not in what could be seen, but in what could not. Standing before these walls, you cannot help but notice how the quiet seems to deepen. Sound is swallowed faster here. Footsteps die into nothing more quickly. The air feels heavier, as though weighed down by what it carries invisibly. If there is a place where the idea of the forbidden chamber first breathes into the imagination, it is here, in the stillness between the stones, in the recognition that silence can be more powerful than any spoken word. We may never know whether these blank walls guard the outer skin of something greater, a chamber beyond them untouched since the reign of Khufu. But their emptiness invites the question. In a monument built to last until the stars themselves shift in the sky, a deliberate absence is never truly empty. It is a signpost pointing inward. Somewhere beyond these unmarked stones, perhaps down a passage unseen, there may be a room that holds the missing story. A room that does not wish to be announced or celebrated. A room that keeps its own counsel as the centuries pass outside. And if we listen long enough, we may begin to hear the faintest echo of it, not in words, but in the quiet weight of all that remains unsaid. The story has been told in many ways, passed between historians, soldiers, and storytellers, each adding a shade of mystery. In the summer of 1798, as the desert shimmered under the weight of the sun, Napoleon Bonaparte stood before the Great Pyramid, not as a pharaoh, nor as a priest, but as a man who felt history's breath on the back of his neck. His army had fought its way into Egypt, and yet here, before this monument, conquest seemed almost meaningless. The pyramid had endured more than 30 centuries before him, and it would endure long after his name was a whisper. It is said that during his campaign, Napoleon asked to be left alone inside the king's chamber for a single night. The soldiers who accompanied him brought lanterns, their flames sending long, restless shadows down the ascending corridor. The granite walls seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, narrowing the world into stone, breath, and heartbeat. When they reached the chamber, they left him there, a small figure in a space built to measure eternity. The facts from this point grow thin, wrapped in the gauze of rumour. According to one account, he emerged in the morning pale and unsettled, his sharp eyes softer, as if they had been forced to look too far into something vast. A close aide is said to have asked what he had seen, but Napoleon dismissed the question with a short, almost defensive answer. "You would not believe me if I told you." He never spoke of it again. Some say that in the depth of night, with the air still and the granite blocks holding their ancient cold, he had a vision, not of ghosts or gods, but of his own future, that he saw his rise and his fall, the crown on his head and the exile on the distant island, the triumphs that would echo and the defeats that would consume them. The king's chamber was known to have a strange acoustic, a resonance that made the faintest sound feel amplified in the bones. Alone, in that soundless stone womb, a man's own heartbeat could sound like the drums of fate. But there is another thread to the legend, softer and more elusive. Some believe that Napoleon's questions that night were not about the chamber he occupied, but about one that lay beneath, deeper, darker, unknown to his guides. In the days after, he's said to have inquired about a room without name, a place mentioned in no French survey, but hinted at in the murmurs of local lore. The officers thought he meant one of the upper cavities discovered decades earlier, but those who listened carefully swore his interest was fixed downward, toward a foundation that might conceal more than stone. If true, such curiosity would not be surprising. Napoleon was a man of strategy, of secrets, of moving unseen toward his goal. A hidden chamber within the world's most studied monument would have been a prize unlike any other, not for its treasure, but for the knowledge it might yield. And yet, if he believed in its existence, he took no steps to find it. Perhaps what he experienced that night convinced him it should remain undisturbed. As with all legends, the truth may be smaller, quieter, a commander, weary from campaign, taking a night to rest in the heart of the world's oldest enigma. But the way the story clings to him, the way it continues to be told, suggests that something in that chamber left a mark on him. The Great Pyramid does not give its mysteries lightly, and those who seek them often leave with questions that were never theirs before. And so the tale of Napoleon's midnight vision endures, a meeting between one of history's most restless figures and one of its most immovable. The chamber he stayed in still stands open to visitors, the granite walls as cold and silent as they were 2 centuries ago. But somewhere in the spaces between shadow and stone, in the pause before dawn, light touched the limestone outside, a thought took root, that perhaps there was more here than the world had yet seen. The search for the pyramid's secrets no longer begins with chisels against stone or flickering torchlight. Today, the work hums with the quiet precision of machines, instruments tuned to read what the eye cannot see. The corridors echo less with the clatter of boots and more with the subdued whir of scanning equipment, their operators speaking in the calm, clipped language of data and probability. Yet, even in this age of satellites and sensors, the Great Pyramid still resists, offering not its heart but only the faintest outline of something concealed. It began with a project meant to map the structure's internal spaces in exacting detail, to test its stability and understand its construction. Teams from across the world set up their instruments at key points around and within the pyramid, using cosmic ray muon detectors, devices capable of sensing the shadows cast by dense stone and the voids that interrupt it. Over weeks and months, the detectors drank in the slow rain of particles from space, building a ghostly image of the pyramid's innards. The known chambers, the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, appeared exactly as expected, their shapes crisp in the data. But then, faintly at first, another form began to emerge. It was not on the old maps. It was not in any record kept by explorers or ancient scribes. A cavity, larger than a single corridor, irregular in shape, was taking form in the scans, far above and behind the Grand Gallery. Its dimensions were not precise. The technology could suggest where the void was, but not what it held. When the findings were announced, the scientists chose their words carefully. They spoke of an anomalous void, avoiding more evocative terms. They were measured in tone, but the edges of excitement were there for anyone listening closely. This was not a minor air gap or a settling crack in the stone. It was large enough to stand in, large enough to walk through, if one could find a way in. Still, the public face of the project remained cautious. No talk of hidden tombs or forgotten chambers entered the official reports. The pyramid is too vast and too old for speculation to be treated lightly, but in the private corners of conferences and late-night discussions over tea, questions grew bolder. Could this be a construction space abandoned mid-build? A secret relieving chamber unknown to the builder's chroniclers? Or could it be something intentionally concealed? What gave the discovery its peculiar gravity was not merely its presence, but its location. The void sat in a place where no practical function seemed necessary, where no known construction technique required a hollow of that size. It was precisely the kind of absence that could only exist if someone had meant it to, and had then hidden it from view. The air in those meetings seemed to carry the same quiet tension as the pyramid itself, as though the weight of the stones extended into the minds of those who studied them. Each expert brought their own discipline, architecture, geology, Egyptology, and yet all were bound by the same unspoken truth. This was not supposed to be there. Outside on the Giza plateau, tourists moved between the monuments under the hot sky, snapping photographs against the perfect angles of stone. They knew nothing of the void above their heads. But for those who had seen the scans, the pyramid was no longer a fixed and fully known shape. It was a question mark carved into the Earth's most enduring monument. The anomaly has yet to be entered, and perhaps it never will. For now, it exists only as a shadow in the data, a negative image captured by particles that pass through it on their way to the ground. But for those who dream of the forbidden chamber, the scans feel like the first faint knocking on a door no one admits is there. Close your eyes and step with me, not in the bright heat of Giza's plateau, but into a place where light has never walked. Picture the stone pressing in around you, each block as old as the first written word, laid there by hands that have long turned to dust. The corridor is narrow, the ceiling low, the air still in a way that feels almost alive. It is not just air, it is the breath of another age, sealed when the desert was young, untouched since Khufu's court still bustled with scribes, artisans and priests. Imagine drawing that breath in. It would carry no trace of the diesel fumes that hover today above the Nile. No smoke from modern fires, no perfume from tourists' scarves. It would smell of nothing, and yet of everything. The resin of cedar beams, long since rotted away. The dust of granite, freshly quarried, but now millennia old. The faint mineral scent of the bedrock itself. That breath would be the same one, last tasted by the builders as they placed the final stone and turned away. The darkness here is not absence but substance. It is complete, layered, weighty, a darkness that has had time to settle into the very grain of the limestone. There is no memory of sunrise within these walls, no echo of moonlight, no drifting beam to stir the stillness. If your eyes strain, they do so against a void so perfect it feels like velvet pressed against your skin. In history, such corridors have always been thresholds. In the tombs of Thebes, they led to the painted chambers of kings. In the rock-cut sanctuaries of Nubia, they guided pilgrims toward the statues of gods. In other lands, they wound deep into the earth to guard scrolls, jewels, or the bones of saints. They were more than passages, they were purifiers. Each step taken was meant to strip the traveller of the world behind them, so that by the time they reached the chamber's heart, they had left the noise and breath of life behind. Here, in our imagining, the corridor leads to something unknown. The possible forbidden chamber, perhaps no larger than a small room, perhaps vast enough to hold a dozen men. Its entrance is blocked, yet the space beyond endures, inviolate. You can almost feel the pressure of the sealed air against the stone, a gentle but constant reminder that what waits inside is not for the unready. The ancient builders understood this kind of space. They knew the power of stillness, the way it bends time. A sealed corridor is a promise that what lies at the end will be met not by intruders in haste, but by those willing to pass through the long quiet, the unbreathing dark. It is not a trap to catch the unworthy. It is a test to see who will listen deeply enough to the silence to understand it. If one day it were opened, the air would rush out like a sigh held for 45 centuries. It would touch the skin of the first to enter, mingling the breath of the present with the breath of the past. That meeting of now and then would last only a heartbeat before it was gone forever, dispersed into the living world. But until that day it waits in perfect patience, a corridor of breathless air, keeping its vigil for the one moment it was sealed to protect. In the scroll of history, Khufu's name is etched with sharp precision, the ruler who commanded the Great Pyramid into being, whose reign is measured in blocks and labour, in the sheer defiance of building something that would outlast empires. His image, though rare, survives. His titulary still glimmers faintly on fragments of stone. Yet behind him, in the long shadow of his power, there stands another figure, one whose name has been swallowed by the centuries, whose face no chisel dared preserve. The last architect. This architect was not the first to lay out the pyramid's plan, nor the only mind to guide the armies of masons and haulers. The early stages of construction had been the work of many: surveyors who read the stars to set the corners, engineers who devised the ramps, overseers who timed the delivery of each block. But at the final stage, when the monument neared completion, the responsibility narrowed to one man. He was the keeper of the innermost instructions, the guardian of the design's deepest secret. We can imagine him in the palace courtyard, the scent of lotus drifting in from the pools, unrolling a sheet of fresh papyrus for Khufu to see. His lines were drawn not in haste, but in deliberation, each angle weighed against both the earth and the heavens. Most of the plan was known to the workers, the grand galleries, the burial chamber, the outer casing, but somewhere on that papyrus, perhaps in a section folded away from all but the pharaoh's sight, there was a notation unlike the others. A mark for a space that was to be constructed in silence, its purpose discussed only between them. What was spoken in that private audience, we will never know. Perhaps Khufu ordered it as a final safeguard, a place for knowledge too dangerous to be common. Perhaps it was the architect's suggestion, born of an understanding that a monument of this scale must carry more than a king's body. It must carry a message to the far future. Whatever the truth, it was agreed upon, sealed not with ink, but with trust. The masons who would build it were told little, perhaps believing it to be a structural cavity. The corridor leading to it would be filled as soon as the work was done. The architect would have walked those halls in their final days, his torchlight gliding over fresh limestone that still smelled faintly of the quarry. He would have traced his fingers over the edges of the seal stones, feeling the perfect fit, testing the weight of their silence. When the last block was placed, he would have stood back and listened, not for sound, but for the absence of it. That was the true test. If the space beyond felt as though it had vanished entirely into the pyramid's body, then the work was complete. There is a loneliness in being the last to see a place whole, knowing that you leave it forever to the dark. Perhaps he lingered there longer than necessary, his torch guttering low, committing the shape of the hidden chamber to memory. He would not write its location anywhere. He would not speak of it again. The agreement between pharaoh and architect was not bound by law or curse. It was bound by the understanding that some things were too important to ever be found by accident, and so his name was never recorded alongside Khufu's. His descendants, if he had any, would inherit no title proclaiming his role. Yet his absence in the records is its own proof. For in the pyramid, there is a silence too deliberate to be the result of chance, a space too carefully hidden to be an oversight. That is his signature, not in hieroglyphs, but in the blankness between the stones. Somewhere, under the weight of millions of tons of limestone, the last architect's decision still holds. The unspoken agreement still stands, and the chamber, whatever it was meant to keep, still waits in them, dark, unchanged, unseen, exactly as it was the day he stepped away. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri are unlike most treasures of Egypt, not gold or stone, but frail reeds pressed into sheets, the fibres still carrying the faint salt of the Red Sea wind. Discovered in a cluster of weathered storage galleries along the coast, they were once the working records of a port in Khufu's reign. Logs of goods, movements of boats, and the comings and goings of men whose lives were spent ferrying the pharaoh's ambitions from quarry to monument. Among them lies one scroll, torn and brittle, that scholars first read for its routine details: shipments of copper tools, bread and beer for the crews, the steady rhythm of loading and unloading cargo. It is the voice of a merchant, or perhaps a quartermaster, a man concerned with measures and timetables, not myths. But then, midway through the scroll, the tone shifts. In the narrow hand between two shipment tallies, there appears an unexpected line: delivered 4 crates to the overseer of the House of Eternity, spoke of the place beneath, where no one may enter. The words are not underlined, not marked as significant, yet they sit oddly in the otherwise dry account. The House of Eternity was a common phrase for royal tombs, but here the context feels different, less ceremonial, more immediate. The papyrus continues with another list: weights of copper ingots, before breaking again into something stranger. He warned me not to ask again, for it is sealed by the order of the god. The handwriting grows slightly uneven here, as though the scribe had paused or shifted uneasily on his seat. Then in the next line, the sentence simply stops. The ink trails into a thin curl and fades, as if the pen was lifted mid-thought and never returned. Was the papyrus damaged there? The rest lost to time? Or did the writer truly stop, deciding in that moment that the thought was best left unwritten? We can never know. The surviving fibres grow frayed beyond that point, the words dissolving into nothing. The merchant's account resumes only in a later column, where he records the arrival of a barge from Sinai, as if nothing unusual had passed between. Scholars debate its meaning. Some argue the place beneath referred simply to storage chambers under the port's own buildings. Others, more cautious, suggest that the phrase, in the context of Khufu's reign, and the mention of sealing by the order of the god, may point towards something far greater: a chamber below the pharaoh's pyramid, closed in such a way that even those supplying its creation could not approach it. If true, then the crates he delivered were not destined for public halls or for the known burial chamber, but for something deeper, something seen only by a select few. The overseer he mentioned, whose name has been lost to the torn margin, would have been a man of rare authority, able to give such a warning and expect it to be obeyed without question. In the stillness of the museum archive, where the papyrus now rests, its faint brown script still carries the weight of that silence. The merchant, long dead, left behind only this sliver of unease, a reminder that even in an age when the king's will touched every stone, there were places that remained beyond reach, even for those who served him. Perhaps the writing stopped because the scribe feared being overheard, or perhaps it was something else. The sudden realization that to set certain truths in ink was to give them a life they should never have. And so the thought remained unfinished, locked in the same kind of incompletion as the chamber itself, present, hinted at, but never fully revealed. Beneath the visible grandeur of the Great Pyramid lies an invisible architecture, one of numbers, angles, and alignments so precise that they hum with intention. The ancient Egyptians were not mathematicians in the modern sense, yet their world was steeped in measure. Every block, every slope, every alignment to the horizon carried a purpose. To them, number was not only a tool, it was a language spoken to both the earth and the sky. The base of the pyramid is a square so perfect that its sides deviate from one another by less than the width of a hand. Its height once mirrored the proportion of a sacred triangle, its slope tuned to a ratio that echoes in temple walls across the Nile. But in the quiet study of these dimensions, researchers have found more than symmetry. They have found hints, subtle and persistent, that the design may point towards something unseen. Some of the earliest surveyors noticed a peculiar pattern. Certain measurements, when traced along the pyramid's base, seemed to converge on locations that held no visible doorway. These were not random alignments, they were the product of deliberate placement. Just as the ancient architects aligned the monument to true north within a fraction of a degree, so too might they have aligned stone upon stone to guide the knowing toward a hidden place. There is the ratio of the base to the height, which mirrors the relationship between the Earth's radius and its circumference, a knowledge far beyond what is assumed for the Fourth Dynasty. There are alignments to the stars in Orion's belt, which in Khufu's time would have risen and set in precise relationship to the pyramid's edges. Some believe that where these celestial paths intersect with certain interior planes, a hidden point emerges, a space neither above nor within the known chambers, but below, anchored deep in the bedrock. If one were to stand at the pyramid's entrance at dawn during the midwinter solstice, the sun's first light would strike along a narrow corridor and fall at a point not marked on any tourist map. Some suggest that this spot, when extended inward through the geometry of the structure, aligns exactly with the theoretical position of the so-called forbidden chamber. It is as though the builders encoded a map in sunlight, one that could only be read on a particular morning of the year. Sand, too, plays its part in the story. Archaeologists working at the pyramid's base have found shallow depressions and lines, barely visible to the casual eye, that trace geometric forms when viewed from above. Some of these patterns may be natural, shaped by wind and erosion, but others fall into ratios too exact to dismiss. They whisper of a time when surveyors drew their lines in the sand itself before committing them to stone, a blueprint underfoot, where every measure had a double meaning. It is tempting to imagine the last architect, or perhaps a trusted apprentice, kneeling in that sand, pressing a chord between pegs, sighting along it to a distant star. The numbers they worked with were not written down in ledgers, but lived in their bodies, in the span of an arm, the length of a stride, the tilt of a head toward the heavens. When they were satisfied, the chords would be lifted, the marks erased, leaving no trace for the unknowing eye. Only the stones once set would carry the code. Today we can only guess at the full meaning of these proportions, but as modern scanners and models overlay the ancient geometry, they return again and again to certain coordinates, points of silence in an otherwise exhaustively charted monument. These points lie in darkness, far beneath the feet of those who walk the plateau, perhaps even below the bedrock that anchors the pyramid to the earth. If a chamber exists there, its position is not arbitrary. It is the inevitable result of a design in which numbers are the mortar and the stars the compass. And like the lines once drawn in the sand, its presence waits for the right eyes to find it, eyes patient enough to see that sometimes the shortest path to the truth is not a corridor at all, but a pattern traced across the ages. In the blinding light of a Giza midday, when the desert seems to hum under the weight of the sun, the Sphinx sits in her shallow hollow, her gaze fixed eastward, as it has been for thousands of years. Her face is worn, her nose long gone, yet the set of her features still carries the same patient authority, the look of one who has seen time itself pass in slow procession. She and the Great Pyramid share the same sky, the same sand, the same winds, and some say they share more than that. A conversation carved in stone, spoken not in words but in shadow. The legend comes from older voices, whispers passed among guides, masons, and desert tribes. They say that on certain days of the year, when the sun stands in just the right place, the shadow of the Sphinx's head stretches long and narrow, its tip reaching toward a point on the plateau where nothing obvious lies. No doorway, no carved marker, only the bare sand and the faintest rise in the ground. To the unknowing eye, it is nothing. To those who watch, it is a signpost. In ancient Egypt, shadows were not accidents. The priests of Ra read them the way a navigator reads the stars. The alignment of a shadow could mark the start of a season, the arrival of the Nile's flood, the date of a festival. A building's purpose could be hidden in how its shade fell at a precise moment. The Sphinx, carved from the living limestone of the plateau, was no ordinary monument. She was an instrument of the sun. Imagine the watchers who once stood here, their linen robes snapping faintly in the hot wind, their eyes narrowed against the glare. They would have known the exact day when the Sphinx's shadow reached its farthest reach, the hour when it kissed the edge of that unseen point. Perhaps they placed a small stone there each year to mark the moment, removing it again when the day passed, leaving no trace for intruders. Over time, the knowledge would be carried in memory alone, passed from one keeper to the next. Some modern researchers tracing this old tale have found curious correlations. On the equinoxes, the Sphinx's shadow points almost directly toward the eastern edge of the Great Pyramid. At certain times near the summer solstice, its line angles toward a sector of the plateau that has never been excavated deeply, where ground-penetrating radar has shown anomalies beneath the surface. None of these findings prove the legend, but they do not dismiss it either. If the Sphinx's shadow truly points to a hidden entrance, it would not be the first time ancient Egypt used light and shadow as keys to stone. In temples along the Nile, sunlight has been caught and channeled through narrow corridors to strike a single statue only once a year. In tombs, shafts were cut at exact angles to allow the sun to touch the burial chamber on the pharaoh's birthday or coronation day. The Sphinx may be no different, her massive form a silent pointer towards something the builders wanted remembered, but only by those who understood the language of the sun. Yet there is also a quieter possibility that the shadow is not meant to lead the living anywhere at all, but to honour what lies beneath, marking it only for the gods. In that case, the shadow is not an invitation, but a salute, repeated faithfully each year, long after the hands that carved the Sphinx have crumbled into the dust. On the plateau today, the tourists come and go, cameras raised, their voices mingling with the rattle of the wind. Few stay through the noon hours to watch the slow crawl of the shadow across the sand. Fewer still would notice if it fell on an empty patch of ground and lingered there for a moment before retreating. And yet, the Sphinx continues her dialogue, unbothered by the inattention. She knows her counterpart, the pyramid, is still listening. Whether the shadow marks a physical doorway or only the memory of one, it remains part of a conversation older than any living tongue. To the builders, such signs were not decoration. They were the binding threads between earth and sky, between what is seen and what is sealed away. And for those who still watch, the message is as clear as it ever was. The sun reveals only what the stone allows. On a clear night, when the city lights dim enough for the desert to reclaim its darkness, the Great Pyramid lies under a canopy of stars. The air cools, the sands release their stored heat in slow whispering breaths, and the stone seems to settle deeper into the earth. Today the constellations above are shifted, their patterns slightly altered by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. But if we could roll back the sky to Khufu's reign, the heavens over Giza would look markedly different, and some believe perfectly aligned to the pyramid's hidden heart. In the 4th dynasty, Orion's belt stood higher and slightly east of where we see it now. The ancient Egyptians associated Orion with Osiris, lord of the afterlife, and his 3 bright stars were mirrored on Earth by the 3 main pyramids of Giza. This was no accident. The layout of the plateau seems drawn from the night sky itself, a terrestrial map of a celestial myth. To them, the pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a bridge between Earth and the stars, a fixed point from which the pharaoh's spirit could ascend. When astronomers and archaeologists began to overlay star maps from Khufu's time onto the pyramid's plan, intriguing correlations emerged. Certain shafts within the structure, narrow, steeply angled tunnels with no known practical function, point towards specific stars. One aligns with Alnitak in Orion's belt, another with Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. These alignments were not decorative, they were precise to a fraction of a degree, as though the builders were ensuring the pyramid spoke directly to the heavens. But some of the most compelling alignments are not to the known stars or shafts at all. When the entire plan of the pyramid is matched against the 2500 BCE night sky, there are points, silent, unmarked within the structure, that correspond to key stellar crossings. These points do not fall in the documented chambers. Instead, they rest in locations deep within the pyramid's core, or even beneath its base. One such alignment corresponds to the place where the Milky Way would have arched directly over Giza on a midsummer night, casting its river of light above the Nile's earthly twin. The coordinate within the pyramid that mirrors this celestial moment? An empty space, as far as official maps can tell, one that some researchers whisper might be the site of the sealed chamber. It is tempting to imagine the architect standing on the plateau under that ancient sky, sighting along a cord stretched between wooden stakes, marking the place where a star's path would intersect the pyramid's axis. By day, the builders would carry on their work, never knowing the true purpose of the measurement. By night, the architect and his select few would adjust their pegs by torchlight, syncing the geometry of Earth to the patterns above. In ancient Egypt, stars were not simply distant lights. They were deities, guides, and judges. The pyramid texts, inscribed in later monuments, speak of the pharaoh becoming a star, sailing the sky as one of the imperishable ones that never set. To fix a chamber in alignment with a star was to anchor the king's soul to eternity, ensuring his journey would follow the same path year after year, century after century, until the sky itself changed. If the sealed chamber exists, its placement may not be arbitrary at all. It could be the earthly counterpart to a specific star's position in Khufu's time, a point where heaven and stone meet in perfect symmetry. In that sense, the chamber is not hidden by accident, nor solely by human design. It is hidden because it belongs as much to the sky as to the ground, a place whose coordinates can only be found by looking upward and backward through time. Tonight, when we stand under the modern sky above Giza, the stars tell a different story. Their old lines faint with the erosion of centuries, but somewhere in the deep structure of the pyramid, the memory of that older map remains. The builders carved it not into the stone surface, but into the monument's very geometry. And for those who know how to read it, the stars may still trace the way, not to a door, but to the idea of what lies beyond it. Long before the sun baked the outer casing to a pale shimmer, before the last tiers of limestone closed the pyramid to the open sky, there were men who moved in shadowed corridors that no one alive has walked since. They were not builders, not engineers. Their hands bore no calluses from chisels or rope burns from hauling stone. They were priests, chosen for a task so narrow in purpose and so vast in significance that their lives would be shaped entirely by it. These were the keepers of the inner silence. Their charge was not to raise the monument, but to tend to one space within it, a place whose existence was known to few, whose meaning was revealed to fewer still. They came from temples along the Nile, their robes marked with symbols not found in the state ceremonies of the day. They spoke little in public, and when they did, their words often drifted into metaphor, as though even in common speech they could not risk touching the truth directly. Before the first stones of the outer structure were laid, these priests walked the bare foundation, tracing its perimeter under the rising sun. They would stop at a precise point and begin their rites, speaking invocations into the empty air where, months later, a hidden chamber's walls would rise. Their prayers were not for the pharaoh alone, but for the integrity of the space. that it would endure unchanged through sandstorm, earthquake, and the slow wearing of time. As the construction advanced, they returned again and again to the unfinished heart. Each visit marked a new layer of blessing, the burning of resinous incense whose smoke curled along the still rough stone, the scattering of ground malachite to bring the protection of the green earth, the pouring of water from sacred pools to bind the space to the life-giving Nile. The rituals were not grand displays, they were quiet, methodical, repeated until the very air of the chamber seemed to absorb them. Their oaths were as binding as the stones themselves, passed down from one generation of priests to the next. They were spoken at the moment of initiation. You will speak of this space to no one. You will protect its silence as you would your own breath. You will pass this duty to another only when the time has come to seal it. It was an oath that reached beyond a single lifetime. For in the decades it took to raise the pyramid, the original keepers aged and died, their places taken by those who had never seen the chamber's beginning, only its continuing. And then one day, the chamber was ready. The final rituals were performed in near darkness, the air thick with incense, the light of oil lamps flickering against the finished walls. The priests walked the perimeter one last time, speaking the closing words. Words meant not to lock something in, but to bind the pact between it and the world outside. In those final moments, the chamber's purpose was fulfilled not through what it contained, but through the promise that it would remain undisturbed. The ceiling was an act of precision. The stones were set in place by the builders, but it was the priests who stood watch, ensuring each block was fitted so perfectly that the boundary between chamber and corridor seemed to vanish. They touched the last stone in silence before the masons smoothed it flush with the rest, erasing all trace of an entrance. When the work was done, the priests stepped back, their task complete. The oaths that had carried across generations ended there, in that moment. They dispersed into other duties, perhaps returning to their home temples, perhaps vanishing into the anonymity of the Nile's villages. The chamber no longer needed them. It had been entrusted to time itself. The outer pyramid rose above it in the years that followed, layer upon layer of stone, laid down by hands that would never know the space they entombed. And as the centuries passed, the priests' names and faces faded from memory, but the silence they guarded remains. Not a hollow absence, but a presence in itself, sealed into the stone like a breath held across 4,500 years. There are moments in archaeology when the past does not announce itself in the form of golden artifacts or carved reliefs, but in something far quieter, a change in sound. In the cool hush of the Queen's chamber, deep inside the Great Pyramid, that moment came when a researcher's heel struck the stone floor and returned not the flat, solid note of bedrock, but a hollow timbre, like the skin of a distant drum being tapped. The Queen's chamber, despite its name, is not believed to have housed a queen at all. Its limestone walls are plain, its dimensions modest compared to the grandeur of the king's chamber above. It has always felt like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit the rest of the design, a space too carefully finished to be merely structural, yet lacking the decoration or funerary markings one might expect. On that day, the archaeologists were conducting a detailed survey, scanning every surface and remeasuring the chamber's geometry. One of them, moving across the floor to adjust equipment, paused mid-step. The sound beneath his foot was subtly different, lighter, almost resonant. He tried again, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The hollow sound came back, faint but distinct. The team stopped their work. Kneeling, they tapped the limestone slabs in a slow, deliberate pattern, listening for the change. It was there, localized to an area near the southern wall, no larger than the space a man could lie upon. The rest of the floor responded with the dull solidity of stone resting on stone, but this section answered with a softness that suggested open space below. Speculation began at once, but the pyramid yields its secrets reluctantly. Removing even a single floor block could be an irreversible act, disturbing the structure or damaging something precious beneath. Instead, they brought in instruments, ground-penetrating radar, microgravity sensors, the tools of modern archaeology. Their hum and click a far cry from the chisels of earlier explorers. The data returned was tantalizing but incomplete. Beneath the hollow-sounding slab was not bedrock, but a gap, perhaps a narrow shaft, perhaps a small chamber. Its depth was difficult to measure, the readings blurred, as though whatever lay beneath was shielded by denser stone along the sides. The anomaly could be no more than a void left from construction, or it could be a deliberate cavity, sealed away for reasons unknown. Those who have stood in the Queen's chamber describe its atmosphere as subtly different from the other spaces in the pyramid. The air is cooler, heavier, and the sound of one's own breathing seems amplified, as though the walls are leaning in to listen. After the discovery of the hollow resonance, that feeling only deepened. Each step over that section of floor now carried a sense of crossing above something unseen, a world sealed in darkness, just inches away. There are stories from the early 20th century of workers who claimed to have felt vibrations beneath the chamber, as if water or wind were moving far below. These accounts were dismissed at the time, attributed to shifting stone or the tricks of a mind too long in silence. Yet in light of the modern findings, they have taken on a new, more curious weight. No attempt has yet been made to open the slab. Conservation ethics, political oversight, and the sheer mass of the pyramid's history all press against the idea. And so the hollow beneath remains undisturbed, its whispers caught between the floor and the bedrock, waiting for the day when someone decides the risk is worth the knowing. In the meantime, the Queen's chamber endures, its plain walls giving away nothing, its floor concealing perhaps the oldest unopened space in the structure. The archaeologists move on to other measurements, other projects, but they all remember that sound, the soft drum beat underfoot, the subtle reminder that in the pyramid, the ground you walk on is never entirely what it seems. The word curse clings to Egypt like the dust of the desert, a persistent shadow cast by the fevered imaginations of foreign explorers and the headlines of long-ago newspapers. We picture dark hieroglyphs spelling doom, hidden traps sprung by careless hands, sudden illnesses that strike those who dare to trespass. These tales are retold because they are dramatic, because they satisfy a hunger for danger lurking behind beauty. But the truth, as it so often does, whispers in a different tone. If the Great Pyramid guards a forbidden chamber, its protection may not rest on magic, nor on vengeance from beyond the grave. It may rest instead on a truth both quieter and heavier, that to open certain places is to strip away the very meaning they were built to hold. The value of a sealed chamber is not in the objects it contains, but in the centuries of unbroken stillness that surround them. Ancient builders understood this in ways we sometimes forget. A tomb, a shrine, a hidden room, these were not created for the living. They were created as bridges to the eternal, to worlds that begin where ours ends. The moment a human hand intrudes, the bridge collapses, not because of a curse, but because the connection has been severed. What was eternal becomes finite. What was untouchable becomes a possession. In this way, the so-called curse is not a supernatural force, but a human one. We diminish the sacred by making it ours. To the ancient priests who sealed such places, the greatest protection was not a spell but the certainty that most would understand the cost of breaking that seal. Once the chamber was opened, its contents would be seen, measured, catalogued, transformed from a mystery into an exhibit. The mystery, the thing that gave it life across the ages, would vanish in an instant. There are modern parallels. A letter never opened retains a kind of power. The moment it is read, its words belong to the past, not the present. A gift wrapped in perfect paper holds the sweetness of anticipation. Once unwrapped, that anticipation is gone forever. The forbidden chamber, if it exists, is like that. A letter sealed for thousands of years, its paper yellowed but its promise intact. This may explain why certain voids in the pyramid remain untouched, even in an age when technology could pierce them. Archaeologists, especially those who have spent decades in the presence of ancient silence, know that not every question must be answered. Some understand that part of their work is to protect the unknown, not to expose it. In the legend of the chamber, the curse is not an external punishment, but an internal one. The one who opens it will have to live with the knowledge that they have ended something that can never be restored. No illness will strike them, no shadow will follow their steps, but the absence of the mystery will haunt them just as surely. They will have replaced the infinite with the finite, and in that exchange, something irreplaceable will have been lost. And so the chamber waits, not in fear, but in a kind of serene confidence. The stone around it is unhurried. The silence within is complete. If the real curse is the diminishment of meaning, then the greatest blessing is the patience to let meaning remain untouched. In this way, the chamber protects itself. It needs no magic, it needs only time, and the understanding that once its breath is released into the world, it can never be drawn back again. They emerge from the sand in fragments, a weathered head here, a broken torso there, a pair of stone feet still rooted in a base that once held the weight of a full figure. The statues found around the Great Pyramid are not as famous as the monuments themselves. Many are unremarkable to the untrained eye, worn outlines of human or divine forms, their features softened into anonymity by the slow work of wind and time. And yet, to those who study them closely, there is something unusual in the patterns of their wear, as though their lives above the sand were far more active than most statues could claim. A statue meant to stand in one place for eternity tends to erode evenly, its exposed surfaces taking the full brunt of the sun and wind. But the wear on these figures is uneven, inconsistent, as though they had been moved, rotated, or repositioned many times. Some bear deep abrasions on one side, but are startlingly well preserved on the other, suggesting that for decades, perhaps centuries, they faced a different direction before being turned. Archaeologists have long debated the reason for this. The most conservative theory is practical. The statues were shifted during repairs or realignments of pathways and causeways. But another possibility, far more intriguing, has taken root among those willing to listen to the quieter language of the past, that these statues were not merely decorative, but functional. They may have been markers placed deliberately to indicate the location of something worth guarding, and perhaps, over time, to hide that location from prying eyes. In this telling, the statues were like sentinels on a shifting frontier, an entrance at whether to a corridor, a shaft, or a hidden chamber might have been marked by a pair of them in some distant century. When too many people began to suspect its position, the sentinels could be moved to another location, their silent gaze now fixed on empty ground, while the true entrance lay forgotten a short distance away. This tactic would have been especially effective in a culture where sacred statuary commanded deep respect. The presence of such guardians would draw attention, while their absence would erase a location from collective memory. The most striking example of this pattern comes from a dig near the pyramid's northeast corner, where a half-buried limestone figure was uncovered facing toward the desert instead of toward the pyramid, an odd orientation for a monument meant to honour the pharaoh. Its base was set into a shallow socket cut into the bedrock, but beside it, archaeologists found two other sockets at slightly different angles, as if the statue had been moved between them over time. Why the changes? No inscription explained it. No record named the one who ordered it. To imagine these statues as movable markers is to imagine a long game of misdirection, played across centuries. Perhaps each generation of keepers inherited not only the knowledge of a secret space, but also the responsibility of guarding it through confusion and deceit. The statues would be their tools, shifting pieces in a vast open-air puzzle whose solution could never be written down. The desert itself aided in this deception. Sand drifts would swallow a statue whole within a few seasons if neglected, only to reveal it again years later when the wind changed. A new position could be chosen without leaving visible traces of the old one, the movements lost in the natural ebb and flow of the dunes. Today, many of these figures rest in storage rooms and museum courtyards, their days of silent watch seemingly ended. Yet even in their current stillness, they bear the record of their service. The polished smoothness of one shoulder, the sharper carving that survives on the other, the faint notches on their bases where tools once levered them into motion. These scars are the map of their long, patient labour, a work measured not in hours or years but in generations. If the forbidden chamber exists, perhaps one of these statues once stood beside its hidden mouth, its expression calm, its presence enough to keep the unknowing at bay. Now it may be standing elsewhere, its duty unchanged but its post transformed, continuing a tradition so old that even those who last moved it did not fully understand what they were protecting. There was a time when the Great Pyramid did not stand so far from the river's reach. The Nile, restless in its course, once curved closer to the Giza plateau, its floodwaters spilling into canals that lapped almost at the monument's feet. In those days, the pyramid's shadow would have stretched toward the water in the late afternoon, and the sounds of the river, the lap of current against hulls, the calls of boatmen, would have mingled with the wind off the desert. The ancient port of Giza, now long buried, was the artery through which the pyramid's lifeblood flowed. Barges of cedar and acacia brought the limestone casing blocks from Tura, granite from Aswan, and copper from the Sinai. But if we drift backwards in imagination, standing unseen on that shore, it is not difficult to believe they carried more than stone. Among the creak of timbers and the scrape of ropes, there may have been cargo whose significance was understood by only a few, cargo destined not for the visible galleries and chambers, but for a place no common worker would ever tread. In such a scenario, the journey would have been orchestrated in secrecy. The barge might arrive under the cover of night, or during the confusion of a festival, when the port was crowded and eyes were elsewhere. Its load would be small enough to draw no notice, yet heavy in ways that mattered. A sealed chest of carved wood perhaps, or bundles swaddled in linen and resin to mask their scent. Instead of being hauled along the main causeway with the rest of the building material, the cargo might be guided to a narrower canal, one known only to the architects and the priests of the inner silence. That waterway could lead to a point below the plateau where a concealed shaft, now choked with sand and forgotten, descended into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It would not have been an entrance in the way we imagine a doorway, more likely a vertical drop, accessible only by ropes and lit by the faint glow of oil lamps. In the muffled air of that shaft, the items would be lowered by steady hands, disappearing into the dark. There, in the unfinished stillness of the chamber to be, they would rest while the walls rose around them. Once the structure was complete, the shaft itself could be filled with rubble and sealed beneath the pavement, its existence erased from the surface. When the Nile's course eventually shifted, the desert would swallow any trace of the approach, leaving only dry sand where once the water had carried its hidden freight. The river's retreat would seal the secret even more effectively than stone. Without water, the old canal routes became nothing more than shallow depressions in the land, soon levelled by wind and time. Modern visitors walking the plateau see only the shimmering horizon, never guessing that the Nile once came so close that a pharaoh's architects could have used it as a private road. Even today, excavations near the ancient port have turned up strange anomalies, remnants of heavy wooden rollers, far smaller than those used for stone, fragments of ropes too fine for hauling massive blocks, but too coarse for common use, and scraps of worked cedar that show no signs of weathering. These could be the leftover traces of something precious that once passed this way, carried quietly past the way, crowded docks toward a destination no longer visible. The Nile was more than a river to ancient Egypt. It was a lifeline, a mirror of the Milky Way in the night sky, a pathway between worlds. To carry an offering or a secret cargo by water was to sanctify it, to let it be borne on the same current that fed the fields and temples. In that way, the delivery to the hidden shaft would not have been merely logistical, it would have been symbolic, a passage through both earthly and divine domains before it reached its eternal rest. Now the river flows at a distance, its course shifted by time, and the desert lies dry between its banks and the pyramid. But if one listens closely on a quiet night, when the wind drops and the air is still, it's tempting to believe there is an echo there. The faint sound of water lapping against a hull, the creak of a rope, the whisper of something precious being taken from the light and lowered into the dark. In the architecture of the ancient world, thresholds were never simply doorways. They were moments, spaces deliberately shaped to slow the body, still the mind, and prepare the spirit. Before the most sacred chambers, there was often an antechamber, a room that did not merely precede the inner sanctum, but transformed the one who entered, turning them from a traveller of the outer world into a guest of the inner one. If the forbidden chamber exists within the Great Pyramid, it is likely that such a place lies before it, not grand or ostentatious, but quietly disorienting in its perfection. Perhaps the ceiling would be low enough to draw the head down in unconscious reverence. Perhaps the floor would tilt ever so slightly, so that each step forward carried the sense of being drawn inward, as if gravity itself leaned toward the heart of the space. Sound would be the first change. In many ancient structures, the acoustics were tuned as carefully as the masonry. In an antechamber, a whisper might carry farther than a shout, the air reshaping every noise into a single sustained tone. Footsteps could seem to pause mid-stride, their echoes holding for a heartbeat before fading, a reminder that time here does not behave as it does outside. The effect would be subtle, enough to unsettle without alarming, coaxing the mind into a more attentive state. Light, too, would play its part, or the absence of it. Perhaps a narrow shaft allowed a single beam of sunlight to touch the wall at a precise moment in the year, marking the transition between worlds. Or perhaps the antechamber was always in half shadow, forcing the eyes to adjust, to slow down, to see in new ways. In other cultures, these spaces were lined with images and symbols, the final lessons before the initiate crossed into the place of mystery. The walls of the antechamber might depict the journey of the soul, the trials of the gods, or the blessings of the earth. But in the Great Pyramid, where blank stone often speaks louder than carved relief, the preparation might have been achieved through emptiness alone. The absence of imagery could have been a deliberate stripping away, leaving the visitor without distraction, with only their own thoughts to carry forward. We can imagine the procession. A small group, perhaps only the pharaoh and his most trusted priests, moves in silence, the flicker of oil lamps barely reaching the walls. The air grows cooler, denser. The scent of incense clings to the limestone, though no brazier burns here. The antechamber seems to breathe with them, a pause before the final breath is taken. They stand for a moment, knowing that beyond the next threshold lies the place no outsider will ever see again. There is a psychological genius in such a design. By the time one passes through the antechamber, they are no longer merely walking. They are entering a state of readiness. Whatever lies ahead will not be met casually. It will be met as one meets the dawn after a long night, with quiet awe, with a mind already half in another world. Perhaps this is why, if the chamber has remained sealed, its memory still holds weight. Even in imagining it, we sense that an antechamber would not have been a hallway to hurry through, but a room that demanded stillness. In such a place, The purpose of the chamber ahead could be felt before it was seen, the air itself infused with the gravity of what lay beyond. And if the forbidden chamber has waited these thousands of years, then its antechamber has waited too, preserving that moment of pause, that subtle shift from the known to the unknown. The silence there would be perfect still, ready to receive the footsteps that have not sounded since the day it was sealed. There are stones in the Great Pyramid that yield like old bread under the pressure of a finger, sandstone so soft that the desert wind has been shaving it away, grain by grain, for thousands of years. And then there are others that resist with a silence bordering on defiance. Granite, drawn from quarries hundreds of miles to the south, polished smooth in its youth, but now burnished harder still by age, locks into place with the precision of a puzzle whose solution has been forgotten. Together, these stones form barriers that are less like doors and more like verdicts. When the builders sealed a chamber, they did not simply slide a block into an opening. They wedged it into the geometry of the pyramid itself, each surrounding stone pressing against it from multiple angles, as though the weight of the entire monument leaned upon that one point. In time, gravity deepened the bond, the tiny imperfections between the blocks filling with the fine dust of centuries, which settled, compacted, and hardened into a kind of natural cement. Attempts to breach such seals, in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, and in the age of modern explorers, have often ended the same way, with the stone refusing to move. Even when tools cut a channel into the edge of a block, the rest holds fast, anchored not only by its own weight but by the lock of every stone around it. In some cases, the effort to force it free only tightens the fit. As the pressure redistributes and clamps down harder, it is tempting to think of the seal as an obstacle placed in the way of the curious. But over time, it becomes something else. The pyramid settles under its own mass, the stones adjusting to each other's shapes like bones knitting in a healed fracture. The seal, once a deliberate choice by the builders, becomes part of the living structure, not an object to be removed, but a limb of the body itself. Granite is particularly merciless in this regard. It does not wear evenly. It resists chisel, drill, and wedge. A hairline crack in granite can take centuries to widen, and when it does, it often does so without warning. A sudden fracture that comes not from weakness, but from the slow, invisible pressures within. This is why many archaeologists will not risk cutting into a granite seal. The damage could ripple outward, threatening the integrity of the whole. And then there is the weight of time itself. Stone is not truly still. It breathes on a scale too slow for us to perceive. It expands in the heat, contracts in the cold, shifts imperceptibly under the pull of gravity. Over 45 centuries, this motion is enough to weld a seal tighter than it was the day it was set. Dust carried on the wind creeps into the smallest seams and binds there, layering into a mineral glue that cannot be pried apart without destruction. The builders may have known this. They may have counted on it. The seal, in their minds, was not meant to hold for a single lifetime, nor even for 1,000 years, but for as long as the sun rose over the desert. And if some far-off generation did try to open it, they would face not only the craftsmanship of the fourth dynasty, but also the slow, relentless work of the centuries that followed. Standing before such a seal, one feels a shift in perception. It is no longer a question of how to open it, but whether it should be opened at all. The stone has become a participant in the secret it guards, a keeper that will not yield its trust lightly. To break it would not be to cross a threshold, it would be to amputate a part of the pyramid itself. If the forbidden chamber exists, its entrance is likely held in just such a grip. The block before it may look like any other, but its resistance would be total, as though the weight of time pressed its palm against the stone and whispered, "Not yet." And so it waits, the seal and the chamber behind it bound together in an unbroken pact, each year tightening the promise they made the day they were set in place. What lies beyond the seal is a question that has rippled through centuries, passed from the tongues of priests to the ink of chroniclers, from the murmured guesses of archaeologists to the hushed speculations of those who have only seen the pyramid from afar. If there is a forbidden chamber, its heart could be many things, each possibility a world unto itself. Tonight, we will turn these possibilities over, like small precious stones in the hand, holding them lightly, without demand. The most obvious and perhaps most romantic is the thought of a sarcophagus, not the one in the king's chamber, empty and worn, but another, untouched, still cradling the body of Khufu himself. This is the dream of treasure hunters and historians alike, to find the pharaoh as he was laid to rest, wrapped in linens that have not known the light since the day the last torch was extinguished. If such a burial exists, it would mean that the known burial chamber was a decoy, a grand stage meant to distract and mislead, while the true resting place lay deeper and quieter, guarded by the silence of ages. Another possibility whispers of knowledge rather than gold. Imagine shelves or niches carved into the stone, each holding a sealed jar or wooden coffer, inside of which rest papyrus scrolls, writings that carry the voice of Egypt's oldest architects, astronomers and priests. The scripts might name the true design of the pyramid, describe rituals long lost, or record the story of the chamber itself. It is not impossible. Caches of papyrus have survived thousands of years in the arid desert air, their ink still legible, their ideas still alive. Such a find could rewrite not just the history of Egypt, but the way we understand the ancient world's relationship to time, space, and the stars. There are those who dream of something even stranger, an object from before Khufu's time, inherited from an older civilization. This theory is born from the notion that the site of Giza may have been sacred long before the 4th dynasty, a place aligned with forces that predate the pharaohs. In this imagining, the chamber might hold a relic placed there by unknown hands, preserved not for worship but for safekeeping, its purpose waiting for an age that could understand it. Or perhaps the chamber holds no object at all, but something less tangible, an arrangement of space, light, and air meant to serve a purpose we can no longer name. It might be a resonance chamber, its proportions tuned to amplify certain frequencies, used for ritual or meditation. It might be an empty sanctum, designed to be entered only in dreams or visions, a place where the soul, not the body, was meant to walk. In this sense, its emptiness would be its treasure, the pure preservation of intention across millennia. There are gentler visions too, a cache of personal items, a staff polished by a king's hand, a necklace worn by a queen, a set of tools belonging to the master architect could rest there in the dark, not meant for glory or display, but to remain close to the heart of the monument, as if the pyramid itself were keeping them safe. And then there is the possibility that the chamber contains nothing at all, that its very existence is the point. To create a space and then seal it forever is to make a statement about permanence, about restraint, about the limits of possession. In that reading, the chamber is a lesson to future generations. Some doors must remain closed, not because of what is inside, but because of what is outside. We cannot know which of these visions, if any, is the truth. Perhaps it is something beyond our current imagining. Perhaps the builders intended it to be so. But tonight, as the desert wind slides across the pyramid's flanks and the stars rise above its edges, it is enough to simply let the possibilities drift through the mind. One by one, they settle in the stillness, like feathers coming to rest on an untouched floor. Whatever the chamber's heart may be, it has been beating in silence for 45 centuries. And whether it is a heart of stone, of gold, of ink, or of emptiness, it continues to keep its own time, waiting, patient, unhurried by the footsteps of those who pass above. Beneath millions of tons of stone, in a place where no beam of light has entered, Since the first ceiling block was set in place, the air waits. It is the same air that filled the chamber on the day it was finished, when the last of the builders and priests withdrew, leaving their torches to sputter out in the outer passages. For 45 centuries, it has neither stirred nor aged, pressed into stillness by the weight of the world above. The chamber lies wrapped in shadow so complete, it is more substance than absence, a velvet darkness that rests not only against the walls, but within them, seeping into the grain of the stone. The floor holds a faint memory of the hands and feet that last touched it, though no mark remains. The walls, whether plain or adorned in ways we cannot see, have been breathing in silence for longer than the span of most civilizations. Outside, the desert is never still. The sands rise and fall with the wind, tracing new shapes around the pyramid's base. Days arrive with the burn of the sun, and nights cool the stones until they hum faintly in the cold. Rain falls in rare, startling moments, soaking into the plateau before vanishing. Time moves there with a restless patience, marking each passing season in its own language of light and shadow. But inside the sealed chamber, there is no day or night. There is no wind to move the dust, no water to darken the stone. If a grain of sand were to fall here, it would rest exactly where it landed for millennia, untouched by breath or motion. The air has no scent, for nothing has entered to change it. It is a perfect preservation, not of objects, though they may be there, but of a moment. We can imagine that moment, frozen in the instant the last block slid into place. The faint echo of stone against stone would have been the final sound, followed by a long, total quiet that has endured ever since. Whatever lies within, sarcophagus, scrolls, relics, or emptiness, has been waiting in that same pause, as if the world outside were a dream from which it has not yet awakened. Perhaps the builders meant for it to be this way. Perhaps they knew that the desert would change, that kingdoms would rise and fall, that the Nile would shift its course, and that the pyramid itself would lose its smooth white casing to time and theft. But they also knew that here, in this hidden place, nothing would change. Here there would be no decay, no intrusion, no forgetting. The chamber would remain exactly as it was in the year of its birth. It is humbling to think of such a place, a perfect stillness, hidden in the heart of something so massive, while all around it the world moves on. And tonight, as the stars glide over Giza and the wind carries the hiss of sand across the plateau, the chamber remains untouched. No sound crosses its threshold. No shadow shifts within its walls. When sand meets silence, there is a kind of peace that no human hand can create anew. It can only be kept. The builders understood that, and time has honoured it. Somewhere, deep inside the Great Pyramid, the silence continues to keep its promise. Perhaps the day will come when the seal is approached not by the hasty hands of treasure hunters or the blunt tools of impatience, but by a quiet, deliberate team who understand the weight of the moment. They will arrive without crowds, without fanfare, just a small group of men and women in soft-soled shoes, speaking in low tones as though they are already inside a sacred place. The air will be cool, the corridors dimly lit, and each step will feel like the turning of a page in a book that has been closed for 45 centuries. There will be no easy way to breach the seal. The work will take hours, perhaps days, not because the stone resists out of malice, but because it deserves to be moved with care. Dust will rise in faint golden clouds under the beam of a single worklight. Each fragment removed will be cradled away, numbered and stored, as though it were an artifact in itself. And in a sense it will be, the pieces of the lock that time and the builders made together. When the final block shifts, the first breath of air from within will escape. Those present will not speak. The moment will carry its own gravity, pressing on the lungs, on the mind. They will feel that they are not merely opening a space but unsealing a thought, one that has been forming, unspoken, for thousands of years. The air will be dry, ancient, with a faint mineral scent, the smell of stone that has never known the touch of light. Lights will be lowered inside, carefully, without flooding the darkness too quickly. The chamber will reveal itself slowly, as though reluctant to be seen all at once. Perhaps there will be a sarcophagus, still intact, its lid perfectly aligned. Perhaps there will be rows of sealed jars or a single object set with infinite precision in the centre of the room. Or perhaps there will be nothing at all but emptiness, a silence so complete that those who enter will understand that this was the treasure, the perfection of a space unbroken by intrusion. The first to step inside will move lightly, their footsteps hushed by dust that has lain undisturbed for millennia. Hands will hover above surfaces without touching. Instruments will take measurements. Photographs will be made without flash. Every detail recorded before anything is moved. And yet, for all the science, there will be something else in the room, a feeling that none of their instruments can measure. The sense of being in the company of the past, not as an observer, but as a guest. Those who enter may find themselves glancing toward the corners, the ceiling, the floor, as if expecting the builders themselves to be there, watching. The geometry of the chamber will speak to them in ways that words cannot. Its proportions, its alignments, its echoes, all shaped to a purpose they may only partly understand. They may leave with more questions than they arrived with, the opening of the chamber revealing not answers, but a deeper mystery. And when they finally step back into the light of the outer corridors, they will carry something unseen with them. It may be the knowledge of what was there, or it may be the realization that they have touched a moment meant to last beyond their own lives. The photographs will be studied, the measurements analysed, but the memory of the silence will be what lingers. For the dreamers of the future, the act of opening the forbidden chamber will not be about possession or proof. It will be about communion, a meeting across time, a handshake between the living and the long gone. And when the door is closed again, as it surely will be, the chamber will return to its watch, holding its place in the pyramid's heart. Only then will the future truly understand what the past was trying to protect. At the edge of the plateau, where the limestone bedrock dips toward the valley, the Sphinx rests in her hollow. She has been there longer than any of the pyramid's tourists, longer than the languages spoken by those who built them, longer than most of the names etched into the Nile's long memory. The desert wind has carved its lines into her flanks, and rain, rare but relentless over millennia, has left its faint signatures. Yet her gaze remains unbroken, steady, eastward, toward the horizon where the sun rises each day, as it did in Khufu's time. She has watched everything. The first gleam of the pyramid's casing stones under the newborn sun. The barges sliding in along the canal, carrying blocks, treasures, and secrets. The processions of priests and workers, each step a note in the long hymn of construction. She saw the moment the last block of the forbidden chamber was sealed, though no human alive can say how far her eyes see, whether she saw only the outer ceremony or whether she has always been a witness to what lies beneath. Centuries later, she watched the first intruders arrive, chisel and torch in hand, cutting crude paths into what they did not understand. She saw their confusion, their disappointment, their awe, and she watched them leave, carrying with them pieces of the story, but never the whole. Kings came and went, empires rose and fell, and still the Sphinx remained, unmoved, her face turned toward a place in the sky where the same stars still travel their ancient routes. It is easy to imagine that for her, the current questions about the forbidden chamber are nothing new. She has heard them in every tongue. What is hidden? Where is the entrance? What lies inside? She has seen countless eyes narrow in speculation, countless hands gesture toward the pyramid with longing. In all that time she has never answered. Her silence is not indifference, but knowing, the kind of knowing that does not bend to urgency. Stone has a different sense of time. To us, centuries are vast. To the Sphinx, they are moments. 1,000 years pass as a breath, a flicker of light across the desert floor. The wind shapes her just as it shapes the dunes, slowly, invisibly, in rhythms that do not rush. She knows that if the chamber is ever meant to be opened, it will be opened. And if it is meant to remain closed, the seal will hold until the sky itself changes. Some nights, when the moon rises over the plateau, the shadow of the Sphinx reaches toward the pyramid, as if in a gesture of greeting. The two monuments, cut from the same earth, share a kind of kinship, both born from human vision, both enduring beyond the reach of their makers. The Sphinx's eyes, worn but steady, may hold the last witness to the moment when the chamber was entrusted to the future, and so she keeps her watch. Around her the world changes. The Nile's course shifts. Cities grow and swell along its banks. The languages of the builders are replaced by others, then by others still. Visitors climb the causeways with cameras instead of offerings, yet the Sphinx's gaze does not falter. She waits as she always has, without impatience, without doubt. To stand before her is to feel that patience. The wind brushes against your skin, the sand moves faintly underfoot, and you understand. She has seen curiosity before, she has seen intrusion before, and she has seen awe before. She will see them again. The story of the Forbidden Chamber, like the story of the pyramid itself, is one she has no need to hurry. Time will decide the rest. There are nights on the Giza Plateau when the air feels as though it has stopped moving, when even the sand seems to rest mid-shift, poised in the delicate balance between falling and floating. On such a night, the wind is absent, no hiss along the edges of the pyramid, no whisper curling around the Sphinx's flanks. The silence has weight, as if the desert itself has chosen to hold its breath. The stars over Giza are not the stars of the city. They are older, sharper, closer somehow, unblurred by the haze of electric light. They hang in the dark like 1,000 small fires, their slow turning a reminder that the earth beneath them is always moving. Yet tonight, they seem to pause, suspended over the plateau in a quiet that is almost expectant. From a distance, the Great Pyramid is still just a shape against the night, the perfect geometry of its edges softened into shadow. But standing closer, you might feel a strange pull, as though the vast body of stone is leaning upward ever so slightly, its tip tilting toward the heavens. It is an illusion, of course, but in the stillness the mind begins to imagine. Perhaps the pyramid is listening for something it once heard clearly, thousands of years ago, when the sky above it was different, and the constellations sang in their appointed places. In that imagined music, there would be no human voice, no instrument. It would be the sound of alignment, of stone and star in perfect accord, of the earth turning in rhythm with the sky. The builders may have heard it in their own way, not with their ears, but in the harmony of their design. Tonight, in this rare, windless quiet, it is tempting to think the pyramid hears it again, faintly, like an old melody carried from another age. The Sphinx watches, as she always does, her gaze unblinking. If she knows the song, she gives no sign. The sand around her is still, the hollows and ridges frozen in their nightly shapes. Even the air feels held, as if moving would break something fragile. The plateau has become a vast listening room, and every stone, every grain of sand is part of the audience. There is no revelation, no sudden movement, no flash of light, just the sense of an unspoken connection between the ground and the sky, as if the two are sharing a secret. Perhaps this is what the Forbidden Chamber is, at its deepest level. Not a place of gold or papyrus, but a point in the world where such moments are possible. A place designed to listen for something beyond the span of a single life. And then, as gently as it began, the night exhales. A breeze stirs at the pyramid's base, the sand begins its slow migration once more, and the stars resume their quiet turning. Whatever passed between them and the stone is folded back into the rhythm of the desert, waiting for another still night to emerge again. Those who are there will remember it not as a vision or an omen, but as a feeling, that for a breath of time, the world paused and the pyramid leaned into the stars as if to hear a forgotten song. Some mysteries are not made of stone at all. They are made of thought, not the thought of one mind, but of many, layered over centuries until they take on a life of their own. The forbidden chamber may be one such mystery, not simply a room sealed away in darkness, but the pyramid's own long, unbroken dream. From the moment the first stone was laid, the pyramid began to gather more than mass. It gathered meaning. Every hand that touched it left an invisible imprint. Every measurement, every alignment to the stars, every offering burned at its base became part of its mind. Over the decades of its construction, that mind grew. The workers did not know it. The priests perhaps suspected it. But by the time the final block was set, the pyramid was no longer just an object, it was a presence. If the forbidden chamber exists, perhaps it is not meant to hold anything in the way we understand possession. Perhaps it is the heart of that presence, a place shaped not to store a treasure, but to give form to the pyramid's own dreaming. We tend to think of dreams as fragile, easily lost when we wake, but some dreams, if left undisturbed, become landscapes in themselves, whole worlds, vivid and complete, that exist nowhere but in the mind of the dreamer. Imagine that chamber now, wrapped in perfect darkness, holding the same air it has held for 45 centuries. In that stillness, the pyramid's dream continues without interruption, like a candle burning in a room no one enters. Outside, dynasties have risen and fallen, ships have sailed and been lost, entire languages have vanished into the dust. Inside, the dream has not noticed. It moves at its own pace, untethered to our calendars, deepening in ways we cannot measure. What does the pyramid dream about? Perhaps of the river that once touched its feet, or the stars that crowned it in its youth. Perhaps it dreams of the hands that shaped it, the chants that echoed in its corridors before the seal was closed. Or perhaps it dreams of nothing in particular, just a sensation, like the warmth of the sun on stone, the coolness of the night air, the soft pressure of the desert against its sides. To open the chamber would be to wake it, and like waking anyone from a long sleep, there is a risk. The dream might vanish in an instant, leaving only the bare room behind. What once was alive in imagination and intention would become fixed, in fact, and in becoming known, it might lose its wonder. It is possible the builders understood this, that they built the chamber not to keep something from us, but to protect the pyramid's right to keep dreaming. A sealed space is more than an absence, it is a refuge for the unseen. In that way, the forbidden chamber is not forbidden out of spite, but out of love, a love for the mystery itself. So the pyramid dreams on, through the heat of the day and the chill of the night, through the floods of the Nile and the storms of sand, through the countless pairs of eyes that have looked up at it and wondered, and perhaps, in some way we cannot sense, it dreams of us too, of the day when we will finally understand that not all doors are meant to be opened, and that some wonders are richest when left sleeping. The desert at night is not empty. It hums in its own language, the faint hiss of wind slipping over dunes, the occasional rustle of shifting grains, the low, almost inaudible sigh of heat leaving the earth. The Great Pyramid rises out of this quiet, like a single note held in the air, its edges softened by shadow, its mass so steady it feels less like a structure than a piece of the planet itself. We stand for a moment longer, looking up at that unbroken geometry, the way its form seems to drink in the starlight. Somewhere deep within it lies the chamber we have followed in thought and imagination, sealed, silent, undisturbed. We will not see it. We will not know for certain what rests there. And that, perhaps, is the truest gift it can give us. Turning away, we begin to walk back across the plateau. Each step presses a faint impression into the sand, a mark of our passing. The wind is light tonight, but it will not take long for these signs to fade. By dawn, the desert will have reclaimed them entirely, smoothing over the path until it is as if we were never here. The pyramid will stand exactly as it has for 45 centuries, holding its counsel in the same patient way it always has. There is gratitude in this leaving, gratitude that some mysteries remain beyond our reach, that there are still places in the world untouched by our need to measure and name. The forbidden chamber waits without anxiety, without expectation. It does not beckon, nor does it repel. It simply is, existing in a time and space that belongs only to itself. As we move farther away, the Sphinx comes into view, her gaze fixed beyond us, beyond the pyramid, toward the line where earth meets sky. She does not notice our departure, and she does not need to. Her watch is older than our presence here, and it will outlast our absence. At the edge of the plateau, we pause one last time. Behind us, the monuments fade into silhouettes. Ahead, the desert stretches into darkness, the horizon barely visible under the blanket of stars. We take a breath and feel the coolness of the night settle into our bones, as if the air itself is urging us to carry this stillness with us when we leave. In the distance, the wind gathers slightly, a soft exhalation that moves across the sand. It seems almost like a farewell, or perhaps a reminder that the desert will always cover its secrets, just as it will cover our footprints. We walk on, and the sound of our steps fades until only the breath of the desert remains. The pyramid does not change, the chamber does not stir. The night closes in around them both, and the story slips back into silence. Somewhere within that vast body of stone, the air of another age waits, undisturbed, in no hurry to join the present. The desert exhales once more, and the quiet embraces us fully, carrying us gently out of its timeless watch.